You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. In a remote village in the African nation of Zaire, a pregnant woman laid in bed, shaking from fever in the dead of night. She'd been sick for more than a week and was often up all night hacking and coughing. She didn't have an appetite and sometimes couldn't even swallow water. She worried that this awful disease was starting to hurt the baby growing inside of her. She turned over on the soft mat she used as a bed and closed her eyes and felt a chill rush over her. She opened her eyes and could just make out a dark shape looming above her. The woman took a deep breath, and with every ounce of energy she could muster, she grabbed the lantern from beside her mat and swung it at the intruder. But the lantern just swung through the air. The woman sat up and looked around her single-room home, and she saw it was totally empty. She realized she had just been seeing things, but that didn't make her feel any better. The woman began to cry, but as she wiped her eyes, she looked down at her hands and she stopped. Her tears were red and sticky. She was crying blood. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm MrBallen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, the next time the follow button is out of their house, please sneak in and switch the minute and hour hand on their kitchen clock. This episode is called River of Blood. On a hot and sticky morning in August of 1976, 44-year-old Mabalo Lokela woke up drenched in sweat. It was his first morning back in his remote village of Yambuku in the country of Zaire, and he didn't feel right. Mabalo was the school headmaster in a poor community that lacked basic necessities like phones, running water, and electricity. He could almost never afford the luxury of a real vacation, but he had spent the past 2 weeks traveling Zaire's rainforests. He'd visited friends and family and spent some time hunting rainforest game like monkeys, antelope, and red river hogs. He'd had a great time, even though toward the end of the trip, he developed a persistent headache that developed into a fever. On the last morning, he woke up feeling shaky and nauseous, which made the long van ride back home absolutely awful. Mabalo had hoped that a good night's sleep in his own bed would help him feel better, but now, as he lay there staring up at the ceiling, he was feeling even worse. His stomach was churning and he felt a bit dizzy too. He could tell this fever was not about to go away on its own. He needed medication. The only medical care that was available was a local clinic that was staffed by Belgian nuns and a few villagers. There were no doctors, and the clinic was really just set up to provide prenatal care for pregnant women. But usually, the nuns did have enough medication to tend to the village's basic medical needs. So Mabalo dragged himself out of bed, careful not to disturb his sleeping wife. He fished a clean shirt out of his travel bag, and then made the long walk from his home down the dirt road all the way to the clinic. 20 minutes later, Mabalo felt weary from walking in the morning sun, but he could see the distinctive red metal roofs of the complex that housed the clinic just ahead. He felt grateful that these nuns from so far away had come to live in their village, especially today. He really needed their help. Once Mabalo had crossed the clinic's courtyard and stepped through the door, he felt a bit better. It was still cool inside, since the sun had not been up long enough to warm the building up yet. He looked down the row of beds, all kept impeccably tidy, and then he looked along one wall, and he saw a nurse was putting a few pill bottles into a row of beat-up supply cabinets. Mabalo knew this nurse. He was a local man who was named Sakado, who worked for the nuns. Sakado waved, and then asked Mabalo what brought him to the clinic that morning. Mabalo pointed at his head and said he'd been sick with a headache and fever for days. Sakado nodded sympathetically and asked Mabalo to have a seat in one of the little folding chairs by the door. One of the nuns would be over to talk to him shortly. As soon as Mabalo sat down, he closed his eyes and leaned his aching head back against the cool cement wall. He was lost in a daydream when he heard the click of footsteps on the clay tile floor, and then a soothing voice spoke his name. He opened his eyes to greet a short Belgian nun in a white linen dress. The nun pulled down the cotton face mask she was wearing and introduced herself as Sister Adela. She beckoned him over to one of the beds and told him he was welcome to lie down while she took his vitals, and so MrBallen happily obliged. After a quick exam, the nun told MrBallen that he probably had malaria, a disease carried by mosquitoes that runs rampant in much of Africa. It's usually characterized by fever and flu-like symptoms, just like MrBallen had. And so, Sister Adela moved over to the worn cabinets along the wall and pulled out a syringe that was full of clear liquid. She explained that the liquid was a medication called quinine, which treated malaria. Sister Adela gently stuck the needle into MrBallen's left arm and then pushed the medicine inside of him, and then she set the syringe aside and put a bit of cotton over the drop of blood from the needle. She told MrBallen to go home and take a nap, and he'd be back to normal in a couple of days. MrBallen thanked her, then slowly stood up and made his way out of the clinic. 8 days later, MrBallen's wife, Mbuzu, spooned some broth into a bowl and set it beside the bed she shared with her husband. She tied her long braids with a strip of leather and slipped into her shoes by the door. Her shoes looked miniature next to MrBallen's shoes. He towered over her when they stood side by side. But now, as he was curled up in bed, she thought he looked so small. MrBallen was still sick despite having gone to the clinic. In fact, after visiting the clinic, he came back and developed diarrhea and was vomiting so much that Mbuzu thought that he must be dangerously dehydrated. Her husband was so weak he couldn't even get out of bed. Mbuzu knew she needed to get her husband more help, so she told MrBallen she'd be right back, and she started walking to the clinic herself. When Mbuzu stepped into the clinic, she saw Sister Adela tending to a patient. Mbuzu waved her down and told her that her husband's symptoms had only gotten worse. She begged Sister Adela to please come home with her and see MrBallen. Sister Adela seemed alarmed that MrBallen was still sick, and so she agreed to go. Sister Adela told her mother superior that she'd be back in an hour. When the two women reached MrBallen's bedside, Mbuzu gasped. Her husband wasn't moving, and there was blood oozing from his eyes and ears. Mbuzu screamed and rushed to her husband. MrBallen opened his mouth like he was going to speak. Mbuzu leaned closer to hear whatever he was going to say, but then jumped back as a small river of blood gushed out of his mouth, trailing down his chin and staining their bedsheets. Horrified, Mbuzu turned to Sister Adela, who stared in disbelief. Then Mbuzu heard MrBallen begin to throw up, and so she grabbed a bucket just as he vomited up bile and blood. Mbuzu kept telling her husband that he'd be okay, but Sister Adela quietly shook her head. Mbuzu could tell by the nun's shell-shocked expression that she clearly had no idea what to do. Sister Adela just said she'd give him another injection of quinine, even though the last shot had done no good at all. After giving him the quinine injection, Sister Adela stayed a bit longer, helping Mbuzu clean up the blood dripping from her husband's eyes and ears. Once he was all cleaned up, Sister Adela told the couple that she promised to check in the next morning. But as she left, Mbuzu began to worry that tomorrow might be too late. A few days later, on September 7th, 1976, Mbuzu held her husband's hand as he took sharp, labored breaths. Sister Adela's quinine injections had not done anything. MrBallen was still unbelievably sick, his eyes had not stopped bleeding, and his saliva was red with blood. Mbuzu could hear blood gurgle in her husband's throat as he struggled to get air. She squeezed his hand helplessly until she heard her husband stop breathing. Suddenly, Mbuzu felt a terrible emptiness. Her husband was dead. She wrapped their bedsheet around MrBallen, letting her tears fall onto his motionless body. A few hours later, Mbuzu stooped over MrBallen's body alongside the women of MrBallen's family and some of Mbuzu's closest friends. Their front yard was full of neighbors and loved ones who came to sit with Mbuzu as she grieved. Despite her grief, Mbuzu felt touched by how many people mobilized to support her. Mbuzu and the other women washed MrBallen's body and wrapped him in a clean burial shroud. This was the funeral tradition in their village. Tomorrow, the men in the village would move MrBallen to the graveyard to be buried. A few days later, on the morning after MrBallen's funeral, Mbuzu awoke feeling totally exhausted. She'd barely eaten since her husband died, and she was completely worn out from crying. The moment she sat up, her head began to throb. She rubbed her temples, trying to ease the pain, and then, without warning, she felt vomit surge in her throat. She barely had time to run outside before she threw up. Mbuzu knew this had to be more than just exhaustion. She cleaned herself up and then headed for the clinic right away. Mabalo's nurse friend, Sukato, had just finished sweeping the floor when Mbuzu appeared at the doorstep that morning. She looked awful. Even though the morning was still fairly cool, Sukato could see that Mbuzu was sweating profusely. Sukato felt a shiver run up his spine as he remembered the day that Mabalo had stumbled through the clinic doorway. He'd looked just as sick as Mbuzu looked now. He told Mbuzu to sit down, and then he ran out back to grab the nuns. Sukato came back inside with Sister Adela, and together they led Mbuzu to a bed. Sukato gave Mbuzu an encouraging smile, even though he feared she'd caught the same disease as Mabalo, which obviously killed Mabalo. And when his eyes met Mbuzu's, he could tell she was fearing the same thing. A few days later, in mid-September, Sukato was at work, busy refilling syringes with quinine, the malaria medicine. Behind him, Mbuzu's mother, sister, and daughter were all lying in clinic beds alongside Mbuzu. All of them were suffering from the same high fever and persistent headache. Mbuzu's mother had started hallucinating, especially at night. Sometimes when she was sleepy and her fever was spiking, she'd say that her dead son-in-law was standing in the clinic. Other times, she would see shadows that were not there. Sukato felt certain that these women did not have malaria. For one thing, malaria is not contagious, so it made no sense that 4 women from the same family had gotten sick one after another. Then there was the way that Sister Adela had described Mabalo bleeding from his eyes, ears, and mouth before dying. Sukato had never seen malaria cause something like that. To Sukato, it seemed like this bleeding sickness was something new and that it was somehow spreading among families. Mbuzu and her relatives had not started bleeding yet, but if their illness progressed anything like Mabalo's had, it wouldn't be long until they did. The thought of an entire room full of patients all bleeding from their eyes horrified Sukato. And if their disease really was contagious, then he could be lying in bed among them by tomorrow bleeding out of his eyes. But then he looked across the room to a perfectly healthy pregnant woman who was resting in bed with an IV in her arm. She had come in for a routine checkup and prenatal vitamins. For this woman and everyone else in Yambuku, the little clinic was the only healthcare they had. It was literally the difference between life and death for countless villagers. Sukato knew that whatever the risk, he had to keep coming back to work. People were counting on him. Full of renewed purpose, Sukato finished filling the syringes of quinine and went to help his patients. A week later, just before sunrise, Sukato stood outside the clinic door with a growing sense of dread. More and more villagers were getting sick, all with the same horrible symptoms. 21 people had come to the clinic with this disease so far, and every single one of them had lingered in bed, unable to eat or drink, growing so weak that they could barely lift their heads, until finally, around the 10-day mark after getting sick, blood would start leaking from their ears and eyes. Some patients had red-stained teeth from all the blood pooling in their mouths. After that, it was only a matter of days before they died from blood loss. Almost all of the people who'd gotten sick had died. Mbuzu had lived, but she lost her entire family. At this point, only 4 patients remained alive in the clinic. And the outbreak was far from over. 2 days ago, one of the pregnant women who came for prenatal vitamins began bleeding. Sukato had tended to her himself, knowing that if the mother died, her baby would too. The stress was really weighing on him. Even from the clinic doorstep, he could already smell the sweat and sickness of the patients inside. But as scared as Sukato was about getting sick himself, he was not going to stop helping. He pulled his protective mask from his pocket and wrapped it around his face. Then he unlocked the front door and stepped inside. As quietly as possible, Sukato moved down the row of beds, and by the far wall, the pregnant woman was lying on her side beneath the blanket. Sukato held his breath as he approached her, hoping she was still alive. But as he rounded her bed and crouched down, he could tell that she was not breathing. Sukato wanted to get a wet rag to clean her up a bit, but he knew that duty belonged to her family. So he just pulled the bedsheet up over her head and said a little prayer for everyone who remained in Yambuku. One morning a few days later, so in late September, Sakato sat by Sister Adela's bedside. The brave nun who had treated so many patients with the bleeding sickness now had the disease herself. And sadly, she was far from alone. 17 nuns lived at the mission, and 11 of them had fallen ill with this sickness. Sakato and Sister Adela had cared for them together, in addition to the patients still lying in the clinic across the courtyard. One by one, each of the 11 nuns had died except for Adela, who was barely clinging to life. The Mother Superior had been forced to close the clinic altogether, leaving this ravaged village with no one left to care for the sick and dying. Sakato's sick neighbors had started leaving Yambuku, searching for help in nearby villages. Nobody had returned alive. But it was no better in Yambuku. Sakato did the math and realized that so far, 90% of the people treated at their clinic for this bleeding sickness had died. Sakato pressed an aspirin into Sister Adela's shaky hand and then handed her a cup of water. The clinic had treated so many patients over the last month that they were down to their last aspirin, and this was it. Sister Adela thanked him with a hoarse voice, and he told her to please get some rest. Sakato left her room and walked down the long cement hallway that ran through the nuns' living quarters. For years, this had always been a very busy and bustling corridor, but now it was a ghost town. Sakato walked past empty room after empty room where the nuns used to live before the bleeding sickness had killed them. As Sakato neared the kitchen, he heard the crackle of static filtering in from the supply closet where the nuns kept their two-way radio. He peeked inside and found the Mother Superior turning dials as she tried to reach the outside world. She looked up at Sakato, and he was taken aback by the weariness in her face. She told him that all morning she'd been calling for help. She'd sent out radio signal after radio signal, hoping someone might hear and get word to the Red Cross or the ZAIREan government that they desperately needed help, but so far nobody had responded. Sakato felt a wave of dread wash over him as he listened to the Mother Superior's grim news. Over the past 6 weeks, they'd received no news from the outside world and no additional medical supplies. And now Sakato wondered how far the disease had really spread. Had it gone all the way across Africa? Was it all over the world? Was there anybody still left out there? Sakato needed fresh air. He stumbled out of the kitchen into the backyard behind the mission complex. Nearer to the tree line, there was a row of 11 white crosses marking the dead nuns' graves. Sakato had helped dig those graves. He imagined Sister Adela lying there on the edge of the jungle beneath her white cross, and now he wondered who would dig his grave when he eventually caught this sickness and died too. And then, almost like clockwork, a wave of nausea overtook him. Sakato hunched over and vomited on the ground, and when he looked down, his vomit was full of bile and blood. He had finally caught the bleeding sickness. About a week later, on the last day of September, Sakato was laying in bed staring at the ceiling. Because the clinic was shut down, he had just quarantined himself at home. Sakato had not left his bed for days, and he felt incredibly weak, but so far, he had not begun bleeding from the eyes or ears. He was determined to stay alive through sheer willpower. Just then, the ground beneath him began to shake, making the glass on his bedside table rattle. Sakato hoisted himself up onto his forearms to look out the window. He could see military vehicles making their way down the long dirt road that led into Yambuku. As Sakato watched in astonishment, the vehicles fanned out and surrounded his corner of the village. The soldier then spoke into the bullhorn and announced that Yambuku was now under quarantine. Nobody was leaving or coming back. Sakato was too weak, so he laid back down on his bed and just listened to the sound of the booming voice that was filling the air. The soldier continued and said that people in 50 surrounding villages were now also experiencing the bleeding sickness. Even people in the capital city of Kinshasa, 700 miles away, were showing symptoms. But the soldier said that the whole outbreak began right here in Yambuku. Sakato closed his eyes as the horror of their situation sank in. The disease was clearly spreading fast, and it was also clear that the government had no idea how to stop it. The people of Zaire needed help from the outside, but he couldn't imagine anyone would be brave enough to come to Zaire to fight this lethal sickness. A week later, a 27-year-old Belgian scientist named Peter Pio felt a rush of anticipation as he stepped off a plane onto an airstrip located 75 miles from Yambuku. It was a little more than a month after the first victim of the bleeding disease, MrBallen, had died. Peter was part of an international team of scientists and doctors sent to try to stop the disease before it spread beyond Zaire. Peter looked around the airstrip, taking in the lush green rainforest that hummed with plant and animal life. To him, it was the most beautiful landscape he'd ever seen. It was totally unlike anything in his native Belgium. Peter turned to help his teammates, who were all collecting their luggage from the belly of their little plane. Peter had to admit that he was not nearly as qualified for this assignment to go stop this disease as his teammates were. Peter had only recently graduated from medical school. However, he'd crammed in as much research as possible before he left Belgium. He learned about using protective equipment, taking samples in the field, and how to take and test blood samples. A few days earlier, the American Centers for Disease Control, or CDC for short, had confirmed that the bleeding disease plaguing Zaire was caused by a virus no one had ever seen before. Nobody knew where this virus came from or how to treat it, but they did know where they needed to start the investigation. Nearly 1/4 of the 300 or so cases across the entire country were reported in Yambuku. So Peter and his more experienced teammates knew that their journey would start right there. Peter was last to collect his bags from inside the plane. He told the pilot they were good to go, and the pilot shouted adieu as the plane took off. It occurred to Peter right away that in this part of Africa, people didn't really say adieu, they would say au revoir to say goodbye, which was French for see you again. But the pilot had just said adieu, which simply meant goodbye, as though he did not expect to see Peter or his colleagues ever again. Peter swallowed hard. There was no going back now. So he hoisted his bag up onto his shoulder and then followed the rest of his team off the airstrip toward a line of waiting Land Rovers. 4 hours later, from the backseat of a Land Rover, Peter saw a group of small wooden houses with thatched roofs in the distance. He knew that it had to be Yambuku. As they reached the center of the village, the Land Rover stopped. It took a moment for Peter to see why the drivers had pulled over. The road into the clinic compound was blocked. Hospital gauze was draped across the entrance to warn people to stay away. On a tree nearby, a sign had been nailed up. It read, quote, "Please stop. Anyone who crosses here may die," end quote. Peter could feel the mood in the Land Rover shift, as though the gravity of this situation was now truly sinking in. But nobody said a word, so Peter decided to take charge. He jumped out of the Land Rover, stepped over the gauze barricade, and began walking toward the clinic. As he approached, 3 nuns came rushing out, yelling at him to stop. But Peter kind of held up a hand, and he told the first nun that came up to him that they were doctors, and they were here to help figure out what was causing the bleeding sickness. Peter was touched by the look of utter relief on the nun's face. She said her name was Sister Marcella. She told Peter that for the past 2 weeks, the clinic had just been closed, and the remaining living nuns were simply praying for an end to this horror. She said that she and the others would do whatever she could to assist them, and motioned for Peter and the others to follow her inside the clinic. Peter carried his bag through the empty clinic and out into the courtyard. As the rest of the team got busy setting up a work camp, Peter asked Sister Marcella if they had any records of the patients who'd gotten sick from this disease and died. She nodded and promised to give him all her notes on the 70 victims from Yambuku, 63 of whom were now dead. Peter could hardly contain his shock. He'd known the disease was bad, but hearing the death toll out loud was staggering. 2 hours later, as the nuns cooked dinner, Peter and his team huddled around a table in the courtyard. Peter listened as the lead doctor explained their mission. The next morning, they would head out into the countryside looking for victims. They needed to talk to sick people and their families about when and where they got the disease, and then collect their blood for analysis. Peter was hoping that after a few days of interviews and testing samples, they could get an idea of how this disease was spreading. He felt energized again as he got up from the table and helped the nuns carry dinner out to his team. The next morning, Peter and 3 teammates drove west along a red dirt road on their way to visit nearby villages. Peter was struck again by how lush and green everything was. He loved listening to the sounds of insects and birds humming in the growing heat. It was easy to forget why he was there. But a reminder came soon enough when their Land Rover encountered a big pile of logs blocking the road about an hour west of Yambuku. The nuns had actually warned them about this. Most of these surrounding villages had blocked off their roads to keep out the people who had this bleeding sickness. The villagers had no supplies left to give out, and they obviously did not want to catch the sickness themselves. Peter wanted to respect their wishes, but it was vital for them to see what was going on in these other villages. So Peter and the rest of his team dragged the logs to the side of the road, then jumped back into the car and continued their journey. As the Land Rover made its way into the center of this village, people came out to see what was going on. Peter had expected the villagers to avoid them out of fear, so he was surprised when a few of the villagers gathered right around their car, looking very curious. The driver parked the car and everybody piled out while the team leader went to speak with the village elders. Peter took a little piece of candy out of his pocket and handed it to one of the little boys who'd come to investigate. He noticed that none of the kids playing around the village seemed sick. He wondered if maybe the roadblock had worked. Perhaps it stopped the disease from reaching this village. Maybe there would be no blood samples to collect here, or survivors to talk to. That would be good news for the village, but a waste of a trip for Peter and his team. But then the team leader waved Peter over. He said one of the villagers had something to show them. So Peter grabbed his backpack from the Land Rover, and they followed this villager toward a nearby mud and clay home with a banana leaf roof. At the doorway, they all put on protective equipment, which included motorcycle goggles, gloves, paper face masks, and long sanitary gowns. Then they followed the villager into the modest home. It was cooler inside, but Peter's protective equipment still felt sweltering in the midday heat. Toward the back, Peter saw a husband and wife laying on a raffia mat on the floor. As Peter neared them, he could see they were so weak they could barely move. Dried blood coated their ears and their cheeks from where it had streamed out of their eyes. To Peter, it was like something out of a zombie film, and for a moment, he just froze. But then he remembered where he was and what he had to do. Peter took a syringe out of his backpack and knelt down next to the woman. He gently stuck the needle into her arm and filled a vial with her blood. The team leader knelt down on the other side of the raffia mat to take a sample from the man. Peter stood up and walked over to his backpack and pulled a little pouch from inside. He wrapped the vials of blood in plastic and stuck them into a baggie before putting the bag and the syringe into his backpack. And right as he did that, Peter turned around because his team leader gasped. It took Peter a moment to realize what had happened. The sick man on the floor had just died. Peter just stood there for a moment, totally frozen in surprise. Then he looked over at the dead man's wife, who looked like she didn't have long to live either. To Peter, it felt callous to leave her, and yet there was nothing they could do. They had no idea how to treat this new disease. In fact, the only way they could help was just to keep on moving. The villager who had led them into this hut ushered Peter and his team leader out of the home. As he walked them back to their car, the villager explained that soon that entire home would be full of women washing the man's body and preparing it for burial. It would be disrespectful for Peter and his teammate to be there anyway. So Peter, feeling relieved, thanked the man as he hopped into the Land Rover, and then they drove off to the next village. On the evening of the third day, Peter and his crew sat around their table in the clinic courtyard and compared notes. One thing they'd been noticing was that in many villages, more women seemed to get sick than men. And in Yambuku, a lot of pregnant women seemed to contract the sickness. But that wasn't enough information to actually draw any conclusions just yet. Strangely, the researchers had found that the village with the fewest bleeding sickness cases actually had no medical care at all. The village had only a traditional healer who handed out herbs and did healing rituals, but had almost no knowledge of modern medicine. And yet, his village was the only one they visited where nobody had died. The next day, Peter and his team leader went to that village where nobody had died yet to investigate further. When they arrived, the villagers brought them to their healer. As the team leader interviewed the healer, it occurred to Peter that the healer's home smelled strongly of bleach. He only noticed it because since landing in Zaire, he'd mostly smelled firewood, generator oil, and the jungle. So this chemical smell really stood out. Peter asked the healer why he was using so much bleach, and the healer just raised an eyebrow as though Peter had just asked him a totally ridiculous question. The healer pointed at a bunch of gadgets lying on top of a small table. Most were made of metal, and they looked like medical equipment, while others appeared to be homemade. The healer told Peter that those were his instruments, and he would use bleach and chlorine to sanitize them between clients. Once he said it, Peter almost felt dumb because the answer was so obvious. In the West, doctors used disinfectants to sterilize medical instruments, but in a place like this that was more remote, bleach was a decent substitute. Peter made a note of this in his journal. That evening, when they arrived back at the clinic in Yambuku, Peter followed Sister Marcella through the clinic, watching as she tidied up the space. He knew that she had seen this disease much more than they had, and so maybe she knew something that he and his team had not thought to ask about. Peter told her about the village with the local healer where nobody had died from the bleeding sickness. Sister Marcella said she actually was not surprised at all. She said the number of cases in Yambuku did not really start to rise quickly until the first patient, the school headmaster, had died. Peter stopped walking. The comment kind of struck him as odd. He asked Sister Marcella to explain what she meant. She turned and told Peter that, so far, the cases they'd seen had come in bursts. Every time there was a funeral, like clockwork, the next several cases of the bleeding sickness they would see would be people who had attended that funeral. It was like one big chain reaction. Peter thanked Marcella for the tour, and as he headed outside, his mind was racing. He and his teammates knew that this disease spread most easily to people closest to the sick, but they had not given much thought to the funerals themselves. Could it be that funerals were a breeding ground for this sickness? Marcella had said that it was usually close friends and family of the dead who got sick next, not all the other kind of random mourners who came to the funerals. So it wasn't just that funerals brought large groups of people close together. There had to be something about Zairean funerals that encouraged the spread amongst close family. Peter went to share this information with his team, determined to figure out what the cause might be. A few hours later, Peter sat around the courtyard table with his team, studying all the information they had collected from villages throughout the region. In every village they'd visited, the bleeding sickness had appeared in bursts, mostly affecting close friends and family of the deceased. And they noticed far more women were contracting the disease than men. Then there was another piece of information. In Yambuku, many pregnant women who visited the clinic later got sick. These pregnant women were just about the only ones to get the disease who had not recently been at a funeral for a close family member. Now, Peter and his team knew two things for certain. Something about these funerals was making people sick, and there was something unique about Yambuku that was giving the disease to pregnant women. Peter and his teammates talked into the night, but they just couldn't figure out what the connection was. It was like the explanation was staring them right in the face, but they just could not connect the dots. Peter rubbed his eyes, fighting off sleep. He did not want to give up and go to bed yet. So he stood and offered to make some coffee, and everyone agreed. Nobody was ready to call it a night. A few minutes later, Peter rummaged through the small kitchen in the nuns' living quarters, looking for the coffee. Then he heard footsteps behind him and turned to see the clinic's nurse, Sakato, carrying a tray of food. Peter had met Sakato several times and really liked him. Peter also knew that Sakato was one of the very lucky 10% of people to survive the bleeding sickness. So, to Peter, Sakato was like a walking miracle. Sakato also seemed to know just about everything, and he was always so eager to help. Peter asked Sakato if he wouldn't mind helping him find the coffee. Sakato smiled knowingly and then reached into one of the tall cabinets and pulled out a glass jar. That's when Peter had a thought. He asked Sakato to walk him through the procedure for when pregnant women came to the clinic for prenatal care. Sakato could do it in his sleep. He'd seen the nurses do it 1,000 times. He motioned for Peter to follow him into the clinic. There, Peter watched as Sakato walked to the counter in the back of the clinic and opened up one of the drawers. He withdrew 5 syringes and then told Peter that these were the 5 needles that they used to treat their patients. vitamin shots for expecting mothers, and quinine shots for malaria patients. Sakado said they cleaned these needles every evening to keep them in good working order. As Sakado put the needles back in their drawer, Peter realized what Sakado had just said, that they were only cleaning the needles once a day. He blinked, trying not to seem too alarmed. He clarified with Sakado that the clinic used the same needles between pregnant women and bleeding sickness patients, and Sakado said yes, especially in the beginning when the nuns thought everybody just had malaria. Peter was dumbfounded. That meant healthy pregnant women who had come to the clinic to get a vitamin shot were likely being injected with tiny droplets of blood from people who had the bleeding sickness. No wonder so many pregnant women and their babies were dying in Yambuku. They were being directly injected with the disease by their nurses. The thought of it made Peter sick. Peter remembered the healer whose home smelled like bleach. He had been actually sterilizing his instruments between patients, and so that was why the bleeding sickness had not spread in his village. Now the wheels in Peter's brain were really turning. He thought back to the man who died right as they took his blood sample during the first week in ZAIRE. The villager who'd taken them there had said the women in the dead man's family had to wash his body for burial right away. And right then, Peter's eyes went wide as he had this sudden realization. He thanked Sakado and hurried right back out to the courtyard where his teammates were working, because he had a vital piece of information he needed to share with them. Peter and his team soon realized that the bleeding sickness was spread through contact with bodily fluids. In ZAIRE, part of the funeral custom was for the women in the family to wash the body of the deceased immediately after death. The virus was still very much alive on the dead body and spread when loved ones came into contact with bodily fluids such as blood. Meanwhile, the pregnant women in Yambuku were getting this disease from contaminated blood on the syringes used for their vitamin shots. As Peter and his team researched the disease further, they soon discovered that this lethal virus was originally confined to animals like chimpanzees and fruit bats. MrBallen Lokela, the school headmaster in Yambuku, and patient Zero likely ate infected game on his hunting trip and became the first human victim. His wife Mbuzu and her family then caught the virus while preparing his body for burial. By the time Peter and his team learned how the bleeding sickness spread, nearly 300 people across Zaire and neighboring southern Sudan had died. But the spread was stopped thanks to the villagers' self-imposed quarantine and medical information being shared widely about the danger of sharing needles and touching bodily fluids. Peter and his teammates were tapped with naming this disease, and they decided to call it the Ebola virus after a river in the area. They thought about naming it Yambuku, but they didn't want to stigmatize the village. Since 1976, there have been more than 38 outbreaks of Ebola and over 15,000 deaths. Now, there is a vaccine for a particular strain of the Ebola virus, but as of today, there is still no cure. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Aaron Lan and Lauren DeLille. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Andre Plus. Our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen, and our managing producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub Zaire. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery. You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. Early one winter morning in 2000, an elementary school principal in Massachusetts walked into her office to prepare for the day when her phone rang. When she picked up, the state health official on the other end of the line had alarming news. 2 of the principal's students had been rushed to the hospital the night before with the same life-threatening condition. Even worse, their disease was totally contagious, and the 2 girls had attended the school the day before, meaning any students or teachers they interacted with could now also be sick. The principal couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had 550 kids due to arrive at school in less than an hour. She knew how quickly contagious diseases could spread through a group of kids, and so containment would be nearly impossible, and it was too late to cancel school for the day. The principal jumped up from her desk and jogged down the hall to find the head custodian. When she found him, she told him to round up his team and get to work. They had to do everything they could to minimize the spread of this disease, from disinfecting the cafeteria, to deep cleaning the bathrooms, to shutting down water fountains, whatever they had to do. Then the principal was speed walking back to her office when she heard the shrill alarm of the morning bell. Then she heard the heavy metallic sound of the front doors opening, followed by the dull roar of students surging into the building for the day. The principal tried not to panic, but she knew these students and the teachers might all be walking into a catastrophe. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please ask the follow button to go shopping with you, but then when you go inside your first store, immediately point at the follow button and start screaming, "Thief!" This episode is called After the Bell. On the afternoon of March 2nd, 2000, Kayla St. Pierre could barely keep her eyes open as she sat in class at her elementary school in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Her throat felt scratchy and her limbs felt like lead, and it took all of 10-year-old Kayla's concentration just to understand what her teacher was saying. Kayla had woken up that morning feeling foggy and run down, but she went to school anyway because she hated to miss class. She toughed it out through a pop quiz, then PE class and lunch, but now she was fading fast. Her eyes drooped, and suddenly there was a hand on her shoulder. It was Kayla's teacher gently shaking her awake. The teacher told Kayla that she needed to go see the nurse, and inside, Kayla actually felt really relieved. Kayla stumbled out of class and shuffled down the hall to the nurse's office. She didn't understand how she could be so tired, and when she saw the nurse, she asked if she could just go home and go to bed. The nurse checked Kayla's pulse and took her temperature, then told Kayla she was going to call her mom. Kayla nodded and then curled up on her side on a cot against the wall, and she nodded off. She woke up to the sound of her mom in the hallway, talking with the nurse about how Kayla might have the flu. Kayla tried to sit up to hug her mom when she came in the room, but her body felt too heavy. So Kayla's mom helped her to her feet, and then Kayla sort of held on to her mother as they left the school and went out to the family car. As they drove home, Kayla's mom tried to reassure her that everything was going to be fine. At home, Kayla dropped onto the couch and pulled a blanket up to her chin. Her mom turned on cartoons, gave her some aspirin, and went to warm up some soup as Kayla fell asleep again. When Kayla opened her eyes several hours later, she was still on the couch, but the TV was off, and her mother had tucked her in with a fluffy blanket and her favorite pillow. Kayla threw off the blanket so that she could go upstairs to her own bed, but something strange caught her eye. Now that the blanket was off of her, she could see that she had these bright purple spots all over one of her arms. She blinked and looked closer. They were small and dark, and there were dozens of them. As Kayla's eyes adjusted to the darkness, she suddenly noticed that her legs were covered in these purple spots too. Something was obviously wrong with her, and so she tried to yell out for her parents, but only a tiny whisper came out. She could barely make a sound. Then Kayla tried to get off the couch to go find her parents, but her legs were like jelly. She tried to wiggle her toes, but she couldn't. They didn't move. And so Kayla really began to panic as she lay there frozen. Using all her strength, Kayla did finally slide off the couch and onto the carpet, and from there she crawled her way across the room and up the stairs and all the way into her parents' room. Once she was in there, Kayla couldn't stand and she basically couldn't speak, so she just laid there on the floor in her parents' bedroom, banging her fist against their bed frame. Kayla's mom was initially confused about where this banging sound was coming from, but then she looked over the edge of her bed to find her daughter lying there on the floor. Kayla's mom asked Kayla, what are you doing down there? Kayla looked up at her mom, and even though she couldn't say the words, she mouthed the words as clearly as she could that she needed to go to the hospital. Suddenly, Kayla's mom and her dad, who was awake at this point, both realized that their daughter was in great danger, and they dove into action, turning on lights, throwing on clothes, grabbing car keys. Kayla's mom grabbed Kayla's shoes and crouched down and put them on her because Kayla couldn't move at all. And by this point, Kayla was just crying hysterically because she was so scared. She had never been this sick before. And then Kayla felt her dad pick her up, and he carried her down the stairs and put her in the back seat of the car. Then, moments later, Kayla's parents were in the car too, and they were on their way to the hospital. And as they drove, Kayla just hoped that whatever was going on with her was like all the other times she'd been sick, that a doctor would soon figure out what was wrong, they'd give her medicine, and her life would go back to normal. As Kayla's family was racing toward Lawrence General Hospital, Dr. Michelle Harris was filling out the medical chart for a 10-year-old girl named Terralyn who had been brought to the same hospital a couple of hours earlier. Terralyn's symptoms were very serious and very strange. She had a 105-degree fever, she had intense fatigue, and she had a purple spot on her shoulder. Dr. Harris had started her on antibiotics and ordered full blood work. She hoped once the test came back that she'd have a better idea of what was going on with her young patient. Once Dr. Harris was done with the paperwork, she headed to the break room to get a cup of coffee, something she desperately needed when she worked overnight shifts in the emergency room. But before she could take her first sip, a nurse flagged her down. A new patient named Kayla St. Pierre had just arrived in the ER, and Dr. Harris was needed immediately. Dr. Harris thanked the nurse and quickly went to the ER, where she found Kayla in a sweaty, pale heap on a bed. Her parents stood on either side of her, looking terrified and exhausted. Dr. Harris introduced herself and asked Kayla how she was feeling, but Kayla could barely turn her head to look at the doctor. She mumbled that her body hurt and her arms and legs felt weird. Dr. Harris pushed up the sleeves on Kayla's hospital gown to get a better look at her, and when she did this, Dr. Harris did a double take. Her arms were covered in purple splotches, sort of like that one purple dot that was on her other patient's shoulder, Terralyn. Dr. Harris studied the markings on Kayla's arms and her legs more closely and realized that she recognized the condition from medical school. These splotches were a type of blood vessel disorder called purpuric lesions, and they typically appeared in patients whose bodies were fighting off some sort of serious infection. Next, Dr. Harris examined Kayla's hands and feet. They were cold to the touch and darker than the rest of her body, indicating poor blood circulation. Dr. Harris checked Kayla's fingers, wrists, toes, and ankles, but couldn't find a strong pulse anywhere. Dr. Harris had a sinking feeling as she recognized what was happening to this young girl. She took Kayla's parents aside and told them that Kayla's symptoms all pointed to a rare, fast-moving condition called meningococcal meningitis. Kayla's parents did not know what this disease was, so Dr. Harris spelled out the dangers that now lay ahead for Kayla. Meningitis happens when bacteria invades the membrane that protects the spinal cord and the brain. From there, the bacteria can spread into the bloodstream and trigger a runaway infection called sepsis. The purple splotches on Kayla's skin suggested that that was already happening, and if this was left untreated, meningococcal meningitis could be fatal. Dr. Harris told Kayla's parents that the most important next step was to determine how advanced this infection was. To do that, Kayla would need something called a spinal tap, which would allow the doctors to actually see the fluid in her spine. Kayla's parents looked completely overwhelmed by what Dr. Harris had said, and they clung to each other for support. But they both nodded and told the doctor to do whatever she had to save their daughter. Less than an hour later, Dr. Harris delicately pulled back the plunger on a syringe stuck between two bones of Kayla's spine. The girl's spinal fluid began trickling into the syringe and then through a plastic tube on its way to a vial that would be sent to the lab for analysis. And the moment Dr. Harris saw the liquids swirling into the vial, she knew this was a bad case. Kayla's spinal fluid was cloudy, not clear like it was supposed to be. Cloudy cerebrospinal fluid was a sign there was a serious infection in the body, which was exactly what Dr. Harris feared. Dr. Harris handed the vial to a nurse to bring down to the lab, but, to be honest, the patient herself had already told the doctor all she needed to know. Kayla was clearly getting weaker and more exhausted, and her fingers and feet were turning even darker. If Dr. Harris didn't act fast, they could lose Kayla in just the next few hours. Dr. Harris glanced out the window and saw there was barely a hint of sunrise out on the horizon. Dr. Harris then told a nurse to bring her antibiotics, blood pressure medication, and an intubation tube, which would pump extra oxygen into Kayla's lungs. Dr. Harris hoped all these together would help get more blood to Kayla's fingers, toes, and organs. But Dr. Harris knew that all these measures alone would not be enough to save Kayla. Dr. Harris took Kayla's parents aside again and told them that she thought it was time for Kayla to be transferred to Boston Children's Hospital, one of the country's leading pediatric medical centers. It was always risky to move patients in such a fragile condition, but given Kayla's rapid decline, Dr. Harris felt like there was no other choice. And the doctor told Kayla's parents some very sobering news. She said they had to move quickly because their daughter very likely only had about a 10% chance of surviving the next 24 hours. When Kayla's mother heard this, she lowered her face in her hands and began to cry. Once Kayla was safely loaded into the ambulance for the ride to Boston, early on the morning of March 3rd, Dr. Harris said goodbye to Kayla and Kayla's parents, and then hurried back to check on her other young patient, Terilyn. Dr. Harris hoped she was holding up better than Kayla. But as soon as Dr. Harris stepped into the hospital room, she could see that Terilyn's condition had actually worsened. She looked at the monitor and saw that Terilyn's heart rate was now much higher than it was before, and her blood pressure had dropped dangerously. Dr. Harris pulled back the neckline of Terilyn's hospital gown to check that purple spot on her shoulder, and she could see that there were now many more spots. In fact, Terilyn's entire body was now covered with these alarming bruise-like spots. And so Dr. Harris had no doubt that Terilyn and Kayla were suffering from the same disease. Dr. Harris felt both worried and confused to have two young patients with meningococcal meningitis on the same night. The entire state of Massachusetts only reports about 75 cases of this disease in the entire year. 2 cases in the same night at the same hospital just could not be a coincidence. Dr. Harris worried that these 2 cases might just be the first in a whole wave of cases because of how easily meningococcal meningitis spreads. Just coughing or sharing a drink or snack or even just being close to someone carrying the bacteria is enough to spread it. Both girls' parents had told Dr. Harris that their daughters had attended school the day before they got sick, and they both attended the James F. Hennessy Elementary School, which meant any number of students and teachers and staff at the school could now also be infected. And so Dr. Harris realized the time had come to sound the alarm. So she ran to her office and she dialed the number for the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. That same morning, Dr. Charles Dayton was still at home getting dressed when the phone rang. It was one of his assistants at the Department of Public Health. 2 girls had been rushed to Boston Children's Pediatric Intensive Care Unit during the night with life-threatening cases of meningitis. Both girls went to the same school in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and they had both attended school the day before they got sick. The thought of hundreds of kids catching and spreading a potentially fatal disease made Dr. Dayton's heart start to race. But he had faced enough urgent healthcare crises before to know that worrying about them didn't help anybody. He needed to take swift action, especially since school started in just 90 minutes. Dr. Dayton dialed the number for James F. Hennessy Elementary School and asked to speak to the principal. When the principal hopped on the call, Dr. Dayton explained the situation as calmly as he could manage, but the principal was obviously still alarmed to learn that 2 of her students were gravely ill with a contagious condition. The doctor told the principal that he would need to know more about Kayla and Terilyn. Once he understood how these girls were connected, beyond just going to the same school, he could begin to figure out how they had both contracted the meningococcal meningitis bacteria. Comparing the schedules of the girls would also help determine who they came into contact with, and therefore who was at greater risk of now getting sick. The principal put Dr. Dayton on hold while she went to get the girls' files. Moments later, she came back on the line with surprising news. Kayla and Terilyn had almost no contact in school. The girls were in different grades, so they had no classes in common, and they also took lunch and recess at different times. Except for possibly passing each other in the hall, it didn't seem like their paths ever crossed during a normal day of school. Dr. Dayton was puzzled. If Kayla and Terilyn were never together, then how did they both get infected with the same deadly bacteria? The doctor would have to investigate more thoroughly later, but for now, he had more pressing concerns, such as preparing a school for the arrival of 550 students, some of whom might already be carrying a deadly, highly contagious infection. If he had received the news earlier, Dr. Dayton would have considered ordering the school closed, but it was too late for that. It would cause too much chaos. For now, it was best to take normal safety precautions. Dr. Dayton told the principal to have all the bathrooms scoured and disinfected and the water fountains turned off. Then he asked the principal to send his office a master class list so the doctor and his team could try to figure out who had come into closest contact with Kayla and Terilyn. After Dr. Dayton hung up, he quickly finished getting dressed, then drove to his office at the health department. By the time he got there, his team was already assessing the student list that the principal had sent over, and they had discovered that 82 students and 7 teachers shared classrooms or facilities with either Terilyn or Kayla. All of them were flagged as potential carriers of meningococcal meningitis. Dr. Dayton told his team to contact the parents of all 82 students and advise them to take their kids to a pediatrician so they could get antibiotics. Then he called the principal back and told her that all 7 teachers who had taught Kayla and Terilyn needed to be dismissed for the entire day and remain off campus until they'd been tested for meningitis. As word of the meningitis scare trickled out into the school community, Dr. Dayton's phone rang constantly with calls from parents wanting more information. He explained as best as he could, and he reassured them that if their kids took the recommended antibiotics, they'd be fine. But later that afternoon, Dr. Dayton began receiving a different type of call. Local pharmacies were contacting him to warn that they had sold through their entire stock of antibiotics. Parents kept showing up, but there was nothing for the pharmacies to give them. At the crack of dawn the next day, Dr. Dayton's cell phone rang. It was a colleague from the state health department, confirming that the state had just ordered an emergency shipment of antibiotics for Lawrence area pharmacies. A fleet of trucks had just left their warehouses, loaded with drugs to fight off meningitis. Dr. Dayton spent a long day at his desk, confirming deliveries of antibiotics, but also fielding calls from local reporters who had found out about the meningitis cases from parents in the area. Dr. Dayton did his best to spread a message of confidence that the situation was under control, but in reality, he didn't actually know if it was. On the morning of March 5th, so 3 days after Kayla St. Pierre first got sick, Dr. Dayton got a call he'd been dreading. It was a doctor from a nearby hospital calling about a young girl who had been brought to their emergency room in the middle of the night, and her lab reports had just finished processing, and the doctor could now confirm that she had meningococcal meningitis. Then the physician said something else that alarmed Dr. Dayton even more. Although this third girl with meningitis was from Lawrence, Massachusetts, she actually went to a different school than Kayla and Terilyn. This meant that the meningitis was spreading to a new pool of victims. Dr. Dayton feared what might come next. A third school? A fourth? Then spreading to other towns and maybe even across state lines? Who knew how far this could go? Now it was Sunday, but Dr. Dayton knew he couldn't wait for Monday to take action. So he thanked the doctor, hung up, and then quickly called an emergency weekend meeting at the health department headquarters in Boston, Massachusetts. Once Dr. Dayton got to his office, he pinned a map up showing the 2 schools up on the wall. He paced the room wondering how Kayla and Terilyn could have caught the same bacteria despite not sharing any classes or activities. And now there was this third girl from a totally different school who had somehow caught the same bacteria. And so the only explanation that made sense was that these 3 girls had something in common, just nobody knew what it was yet. Dr. Dayton stared at the schools on the map, lost in thought. Then an idea occurred to him. If the girls hadn't interacted at school, what if they knew each other outside of school? Dr. Dayton told his team to contact the parents of all 3 girls and find out every extracurricular activity they were involved in, from sports to neighborhood groups to Girl Scouts. Dr. Dayton felt certain there had to be some social thread connecting them, and if they could find it, then they had a chance to contain the outbreak. The next morning, Dr. Dayton was working in his office when he got word that another girl from a city near Lawrence had just been admitted to the hospital with a 104-degree fever. And after taking a spinal tap, a doctor confirmed her diagnosis. She too had meningococcal meningitis. Dr. Dayton slumped in his chair. This was the 4th case in 4 days, with no end in sight. Dr. Dayton desperately needed to find the source of the infection, but every new patient made the puzzle more complicated. The 3rd girl was from a different school than Kayla and Terilyn, and now today's girl, the 4th girl, was from a different community altogether. Dr. Dayton still felt like all of these girls must be connected somehow. He just needed to figure out what the connection was, and he needed to find it fast. Dr. Dayton called his team together again for another brainstorming meeting. To him, the biggest clue was the fact that all 4 girls had gotten sick within a very small window of time, which suggested they might have been exposed around roughly the same timeline. He also knew that meningococcal meningitis can take about 2 weeks until victims begin to show symptoms, which meant all these girls were likely exposed roughly 2 weeks earlier. So Dr. Dayton called in his best research assistant and told him to find out what each of the 4 girls were doing 14 days ago. As his research assistant left to get started, Dr. Dayton's phone rang yet again. It was Kayla's doctor at Boston Children's Hospital, and he had some very upsetting news. The majority of Kayla's fingers and toes had been without a proper blood supply for so long that the tissue inside had died, and it looked like they would have to amputate them. Dr. Dayton thought for a moment about poor Kayla. Less than a week ago, she was probably roller skating and riding her bike like any healthy 10-year-old, and now she was about to become permanently disabled. And the possibility that this might happen to even more kids on his watch made Dr. Dayton almost nauseous. Later that afternoon, there was a knock on Dr. Dayton's office door. His research assistant came in, and to Dr. Dayton's surprise, the assistant looked excited. He said he had just discovered a very strong lead. It turned out all 4 girls were part of the same local girls' club. Not only that, but exactly 2 weeks ago, 3 of the 4 girls had taken a girls' club field trip together to go see Disney on Ice in New York City. Dr. Dayton felt so excited that he nearly cheered. This had to be where the girls were infected. But he still needed to find out how they had transmitted the bacteria to each other. He stood up, grabbed his car keys, and went to find out. Less than an hour later, Dr. Dayton parked at Boston Children's Hospital and hurried inside. 3 of the 4 girls were there. Kayla's case was the worst, and she had actually just been put into a medically induced coma. Doctors had decided this was her body's only chance to fight back against the disease. Dr. Dayton went to Terilyn's room and found her lying on her side flipping through a magazine. She looked pale and weak, but her vitals were stable. Dr. Dayton asked her about the trip to New York. Terilyn sat up in bed and smiled at the memory. She described how fun the long bus ride there had been, and how exciting it was to cross the bridge into the city, seeing it all lit up at night. Dr. Dayton asked if the girls had brought snacks or drinks along, or if maybe they had stopped at some point to buy them. He assumed the bacteria had likely spread through something the girls had consumed. But Terilyn shook her head. She said they had been too excited to eat or drink anything. Besides, they hadn't wanted to spill anything on their outfits since they had dressed up in their favorite clothes. Dr. Dayton was puzzled. If the girls hadn't shared any food or drink, then how did the bacteria spread? Terrelin told him that as their bus approached Madison Square Garden, where the show was going to take place, that she and the other girls had fixed their hair and touched up their appearance to get ready. When Dr. Dayton asked her to describe exactly what they'd done to get ready, Terrelin mentioned something that really caught the doctor's attention. He asked a few quick follow-up questions to confirm some details about this thing she had mentioned, but as he scribbled down everything she was saying, he felt like this has to be it. This had to be the source of the sickness. Finally, Dr. Dayton thanked Terrelin and then hurried to the lobby to call his office and tell them that he'd just found the cause of the outbreak. For the next 2 weeks, Dr. Dayton kept waiting for his phone to ring with news of another case, but it never happened. After 14 days with no new cases, Dr. Dayton knew the scare was over. He felt both relieved and exhausted. It would turn out his hunch had been correct. All 4 cases of meningococcal meningitis were due to a single isolated event. Right before the Disney on Ice performance, Terrelin, Kayla, and one of the other girls had shared a tube of sparkly lip gloss to look extra glamorous for the night. And that lip gloss was contaminated with the meningococcal meningitis bacteria. Most likely, the one sick girl who was not on the field trip had also used that same tube of lip gloss sometime shortly before or after. Although Dr. Dayton was grateful to have identified the bacteria's source, he was left with one question unanswered: how the bacteria got on the lip gloss in the first place. Now, Dr. Dayton was never actually able to determine this for certain, but he guessed that someone who did not know they had meningitis must have used that lip gloss at some point. Some people carry the bacteria without ever actually getting sick themselves, even though they can spread the disease. But the bacteria was there, living on that tube of lip gloss, until the fateful day it was passed around before Disney on Ice. 3 of the girls would make full recoveries, but unfortunately Kayla would lose both her legs, 8 of her fingers, and all function in her kidneys. She underwent 50 operations and was bedridden in multiple hospitals for 11 months. But thanks to a successful kidney transplant, Kayla's body did finally begin healing, and today she actually works with the National Meningitis Association, helping educate others about the dangers of the disease that took so much from her. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, MrBallen. A quick note about our stories: we use aliases sometimes because we don't know the names of the real people in the story, and also, in most cases, we can't know exactly what was said, but everything is based on a lot of research. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Britt Brown. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Ryan Potesta. Our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen, and our managing producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Tasia Pelakonda. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our head of production is Zach Levitt. Script editing is by Scott Allen and Evan Allen. Our coordinating producer is Matub ZAIRE. Executive producers are myself, MrBallen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Senior producers are Loredana Palavoda and Dave Schilling. Senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our executive producers are Aaron O'Flaherty and Marshall Louis for Wondery.